would like to invite Mr. Boštjan Šefic, State Secretary of the Ministry of the Interior of the Republic of Slovenia, to give the introductory address. Mr. Šefic, the floor is yours.
Distinguished guests, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is a great pleasure for me to attend this conference and particularly to be able to participate in the panel of new security challenges of Europe. First of all, I wish to thank President Ladislav Geisser for the invitation. I'm glad to be here, even more so because I am one of those Europeans who believe the answer to meeting challenges and seizing opportunities is a unified Europe. I wholeheartedly believe in a strong and unified Europe, a community of European states characterized by democracy, openness, progress, social welfare, and economic success. As far as security and foreign policy is concerned, the EU member states and EU institutions have been committed to delivering security, freedom, and justice underpinned by rule of law, solidarity, and respect of human rights. Security is a fundamental human right. In today's rapidly changing and even more globalized environment, it is also a priority unlike any other. Although open borders are one of the EU's top achievements, they have also brought about new challenges. We have managed to confront this with success, yet weaknesses and deficiencies have also been identified. Today, the need of efficient and precise policy orientation is strong. Even stronger thought in the need for a consensus of the key priorities of our common security architecture. More than ever before, we need to put our collective interests ahead of our individual and one-sided aspirations. For the EU, the major security concerns and threats are terrorism, serious and organized crime, drug trafficking, illegal migration, cybercrime, economic crime and corruption, weapon trafficking, and cross-border criminality. All of these transform rapidly also in terms of resistance to law enforcement activity. In recent years, the EU member states have had to face huge migration pressures resulting in surge of international protection cases. The new conditions of these illegal migrations were obviously created by the Arab Spring protests and the ensuing events. Slovenia, just like other EU states, is aware of the situation in the Sahel and Maghreb regions and the potential impact of the security in the EU. Currently, the Mediterranean route, in addition to Bulgarian and Turkish land route, seems to be overwhelmingly used by immigrants who attempt to cross the EU external border illegally. A six-fold increase in the number of illegal migrants has been reported for this area. Assistance to and solidarity with member states facing pressure because of migration are crucial. Slovenia has commended to the EU's response to handling the aftermath of October 2013 Lampedusa tragedy and the engagement of the Task Force for the Mediterranean, which identified measures to prevent such tragic events in southern Mediterranean. May I also mention the fact that in the spirit of solidarity, Slovenia assisted Italy by sending the military boat Triglav to assist in the Mare Nostrum rescue operation in accordance with a bilateral agreement. Solidarity, however, only solves part of the trouble. what we need to build in partnerships with transit countries and countries of origins. These countries must be supported in building their own capacity to manage multifaceted migration flows and align their asylum and immigration policies with international human rights standards. Measures should focus on judicial, economic, and welfare reforms that will fully comply with human rights obligations and the rule of law. There is of particular importance are enhanced political dialogue and stronger partnership with third countries in the Western Balkans, Northern Africa, and the Gulf region, where most of the serious threats to the safety EU citizens originate from. Participation in international operations and missions represent an important dimension of comprehensive approach to fulfilling strategic foreign policy and security commitments. Strategy. The EU and Slovenia focus their foreign policy, economic, and security interests on those crisis areas directly affecting their security, especially the Western Balkan countries. This seems to be not only transit countries, but also countries of origin in terms of trafficking in human beings, illicit drugs and weapons penetrating the EU market. Last year, Slovenia seconded 21 police officers to the EULEX mission to Kosovo. The mission aims to establish the rule of law, strengthen the judicial independence, promote respect for human rights, and combat organized crime and corruption, including at the highest level. Currently, 2 Slovenian police officers are taking part in the EUPOL COPS mission in Palestine. Slovenia will continue to participate in civil crisis management missions and operations abroad, especially those conducted under the auspices of the EU. It is only in this way that we can address threats in their preliminary stages, such as the return of fighters from battlefields to their home countries, including the EU. These individuals represent a threat in terms of further radicalization and recruitment because of their seniority and battlefield skills and experience. This calls for a promptly revised EU strategy for countering radicalization and recruitment. I like to emphasize that national law enforcement and intelligence agencies play a crucial role in enforcing the common security policy, conducting operations abroad, and countering terrorism. The cooperation between all relevant EU agencies and the use of their existing capacities should be further enhanced. Measures to improve safety should be based on the principle of making more effective use of the existing tools available in the member states. The second version, Schengen Information System, more effective use of Europol information system and facilitated access of law enforcement agencies to the visa information system constitute the potential we need to further exploit. Moreover, the use of passenger name record for law enforcement purposes and access to the entry-exit system would open up new possibilities of reducing security threats. As regards trafficking in human beings, cooperation with third countries seems to be of vital importance for addressing root causes of this phenomenon. Slovenia plays an active role, especially in the Western Balkans, where its Interior Ministry experts provide training within a project concerning the use of joint investigation teams to fight trafficking in human beings in the Western Balkans at the local level. Europol and Eurojust experts also take part in the project. Another security threat is represented by cybercrime. The cyber threat is one of the most dynamic challenges posed to the security of the EU and its member states. Based on Slovenia's experience in evaluating the implementation of the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, Further steps need to be made in building capacity of competent authorities, in sharing experience, expertise, and best practice in the field of information technology, as well as in providing sufficient funds to combat cybercrime at the national and EU levels. In our view, the European Cybercrime Center represents a key platform for sharing experience, investigative techniques, and software tools. Ladies and gentlemen, a successful development of the economy and financial institutions is possible only in a stable and safe society which is founded on trust in democratic institutions. Security is closely related to economic policy. That is why we must not forget that organized crime, including terrorism, is also a reflection of the current economic crisis and the perceived powerlessness of citizens. When we are developing measures and policies to combat organized crime and terrorism, we therefore need to take into account the root causes of both phenomena and address them. Without this crucial preventive step, our other efforts will not produce the desired effect. The development of the EU security and defense policy requires effective cooperation between member states and a comprehensive approach to tackling challenges at the EU level. The Lisbon Treaty, the European Security Strategy, the Stockholm Programme, and other strategies enable us to take decisive and concerted action with a view of making the entire Europe, making the entire Europe an area of freedom, security, and justice. I personally strive for an increased role of some European law enforcement agencies, which will implement the common security policy and, in cooperation with national agencies, provide for an effective security system countering threats in Europe. Lastly, I would like to emphasize that whenever we are developing measures of security for our citizens, we must always ensure the full respect of fundamental human rights, including the free movement of goods, capital, services, and people. Every new measure developed in the field of security will, of course, have an impact on human rights. But it is of paramount importance to find the proper balance between ensuring security or introducing new control mechanisms and respecting fundamental rights. Slovenia will continue to promote all forms of cooperation and strengthen the role of common European law enforcement agencies. Progress and a safer environment for our citizens can only be achieved through joint efforts, ongoing dialogue, and information exchange. First steps have been made, but there is still work to be done and room for improvement. I wish the participants all the success with the conference and, above all, a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Šefic. After that introduction to the second day of the international conference, I'm sure we are all already looking forward to the discussions. As mentioned before, the first panel is entitled EU Foreign Policy, New Security Challenges. For me, the key word in this title is the word challenges. Namely, my first boss always liked to point out that in every case we face only challenges, not problems. Challenges, then. According to the Collins English Language Dictionary, a challenge is something new and exciting or difficult, which you have the opportunity of doing and which requires great effort and determination if you are going to succeed. We are facing challenges in our everyday life all the time. Also the EU does. About the new challenges in the field of security in the framework of the EU foreign policy, we'll discuss. Mr. Lucio Caracciolo, Director of the Italian Geopolitical Review, Limes. Mr. Steven Blockmans, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for the European Policy Studies in Brussels. And Mr. Erhard Busek, President of the Institute for the Danube Region and Central Europe. The first panel today will be moderated by Mr. Damir Čerenčec from Graduate School of the Government and European Studies. Since we started with 15 minutes of delay, the floor is yours until 11 a.m.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, in Slovenian, I'm used to say hi or good morning to Slovenes in Slovenia in our own language. And let me say from the start on that I'm very honored and pleased to be able to moderate the panel. We still have the problems? Yes. Okay. But you understood what I said. Okay. I'm not a performer or dancer or singer, so I'm not used to work with microphones. It's okay now? No? No. This is better? So it's not technical, it's me only. As I said, good morning to everybody. I think we have exquisite panel today. We have practitioners, academians, people from who can speak about policy, strategy, and practice of European Union as trying to be a global player, global actor. And when I was preparing or thinking about this panel today, the thought crossed my mind in what kind of language we would speak 100 years ago in this very place. And probably would be an old Viennese, the language of my left colleague. Why I'm mentioning this? Because this year we have 100th anniversary of the start of the Great War, and the debate or discussions are ongoing already. Who was to be blamed? Are Serbs or the Austrians? I noticed some kind of discussions in the media already regarding this, and hopefully we will also be able to touch upon this topic today. But with further ado, I would like to ask Mr. Lucho to start providing us with a global geopolitical view on what European Union is doing as trying to be, I would say, trying to be global actor in field of security. And of course, we won't be able to not touch the topic of Ukraine, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and whatever we are doing regarding the European security strategy and the documents in place. So without further ado, I would like Mr. Lucho to start.
Hope it works. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Laris, for your kind invitation. It's a pleasure to discuss what we used to call the European foreign policy. And for the sake of discussion, I will start by saying that, in my view, there is no such thing as the European foreign policy. There is, to be more precise, an algebraic sum of different European foreign policies, essentially those of the member states and of some regions in the member state, plus some more or less formal or informal agencies. Let's think of corporations, churches, NGOs, also some criminal group. So this, the algebraic sum of all this, may be considered a European foreign policy. As far as Lady Ashton and the European Diplomatic Service is concerned, I think it's more or less a structure in search of a purpose. It may become useful, I hope, in the future, but as for now, I think it's a final endorser of agreements and decisions or policies produced by the foreign policies of the single member states. And in the best case, you have such products as Lady Ashton's performance in the Iran crisis, for example, or maybe, I hope, in the future in the Ukrainian crisis. This is a kind of UN function, but without the legitimacy and the degree of legitimacy of the United Nations. You may consider this as my personal opinion. It is my personal opinion, but in my perception, it is also the way the world powers look at the EU as a player. I am, of course, not only referring to Victoria Nuland's dictum, I'm referring to how states in the world look at Brussels and how they are normally inclined, not wasting their time in Brussels, but speaking with the relevant people, like we see, for example, now in Ukraine, where we are represented by the Polish foreign minister, by the French and the German foreign minister. This means that we have, again, a serious branding problem in the EU. Since we used to name things in a curious way, starting, of course, with the European Union, which is everything but a union, and is now probably more divided than ever, also because of the Euro crisis, which is not only an economic crisis, but a cultural one, and a crisis of trust between the members of this monetary union, which is based essentially on itself, with no political and institutional basis. One of the byproducts of this strange branding we have in Europe is that we have the president of the Central European Bank, Mr. Mario Draghi, acting as a politician. But let's focus now for a few minutes on what I think is the most urgent and dangerous challenge we have to face now, namely the Ukrainian crisis. A clash between an ineffective, corrupt regime and the Maidan movement. In this kind of clash, we are seeing already some geopolitical byproducts, which are very interesting and, in perspective, also quite dangerous. What is at stake there, in my view? The real issue in Ukraine, from a geopolitical point of view, is the survival or disintegration of the Ukrainian Republic. We know that the borders of this republic are the borders of the former Soviet Republic. The borders of the Soviet republics were de facto administrative borders in the Soviet Union. Now they are international political borders in a completely different context. This means that they are largely dysfunctional for an independent Ukrainian state, as we see already on the ground. The main geopolitical dysfunctionality lies in the heterogeneous character of the state. We know, of course, of the major East-West divide, but it is only one part of the problem. The differences run deeper in both parts. But most of all, there is a difference of political cultures. I have here a study by the Bertelsmann Stiftung. It is signed by two Polish analysts, Gromadzki and Wenerski. And they introduce us to a public opinion survey conducted in December last year, in which it is stated that 51% of Ukrainians support democracy against 21 who think that autocracy is the best solution. But what is interesting is the geopolitical difference among those two camps. So, for example, in Western Ukraine, we have 77% in favor of democracy. In Southern Ukraine, 56%. In Central Ukraine, 52%. In Eastern Ukraine, I mean the homeland of Viktor Yanukovych and his party of region, only 36%. So half of the Western Ukraine. Quite a cleavage, I would say. To be more specific, I think that we must consider that Crimea is de facto part of the Russian sphere of influence, not only because of its cultural or ethnic character, but for a major reason, namely the fact that they have their Black Sea fleet at Sevastopol, and I don't think that they are going to dismantle it for the sake of Ukrainian independence. The opposite pole is Galicia, centered on Lviv, again for, of course, historical and cultural reasons, the Habsburg and the Polish influence, but also because a de facto high degree of autonomy of this part of Ukraine. And we had even a kind of independence declaration 3 days ago by a so-called executive of a popular committee in Lviv. So I think that the clash between the stubbornness and corruption of Yanukovych and the oligarchs behind him and the Maidan movement may produce, even involuntarily, willing or not, the risk of a geopolitical collapse of a major state in Europe, 45 million people, 100,000 square kilometers, and a very strategic position between the Russian Empire on the one hand and the European Union and NATO on the other hand. Ukraine is part of the kind of gray area between those two parts of Europe, which are, of course, much more heterogeneous than they appear. But this gray area is kind of fighting ground now in terms of political influence between the Euro-Atlantic area and the Russian Empire, Russian Federation. The geopolitical collapse of the Ukrainian state may start with the possible secession of Crimea as a Russian republic, more or less like South Ossetia or Abkhazia, which are formally independent but de facto part of the Moscow sphere of influence, as a byproduct of the August 2008 war, in which Mr. Saakashvili counted on a support he didn't get. And this is a lesson the Russians gave to us, to the Europeans and to NATO, a lesson which probably we didn't learn. And the other possibility is, of course, a de facto or even formal secession of parts of Western Ukraine, including maybe Transcarpathia, which means that if this doesn't happen as it is probable in Czechoslovak terms, it will happen in Yugoslav terms. And this gives us an idea of what is at stake now in the Ukraine. I'm not so sure that people in the European public opinion, but also in the European elites, are that aware of the risks which are implied in the Ukrainian crisis. And then we have the radicalization of the Maidan movement, which this is the main difference between the so-called Orange Revolution and what's happening now in Ukraine, which is taking a more and more right-wing approach. I'm quoting again the two guys from the Bertelsmann Stiftung. It should be strongly underlined that anti-systemic elements absent in the Orange Revolution are visible in Maidan. The current protest is against the ruling elite, but also keeps a distance towards the opposition parties. The right sector, a coalition of far-right organizations with some of them perceived as quasi-fascist militia, seems to represent this group of protesters. And we have to take into account this background too when we read on the papers about an agreement. Well, an agreement which is not recognized by many people in Maidan, not only in Maidan, in Western Ukraine, and is not probably recognized by Russia, is not an agreement. And this is one of the limits we have as far as our approach in that area is concerned. And what is the EU doing in this context? There is no serious presence of the European diplomacy. Our guys on the ground, as I said, are the Poles, the Germans, and the French. And this is a typical EU approach to this kind of crisis, which should be managed by one or two big powers, namely Germany and France, plus one or two representatives of the countries which are most concerned by this crisis. And since we are, as I said, in the gray area between Central Europe and Russia, I'm speaking essentially of the Baltic diplomacies, Sweden, Poland, the three Baltic republics, which tend to converge on a largely anti-Russian approach, which is quite different from the approach, say, of, for example, my country, Italy, which follows the usual conservative soft power and approach and is not in any sense interested in confronting Moscow. And when the crisis gets deeper, then we have the big ones, Germany essentially, jumping in. But we have to be aware of the fact that the main actors there are still the Russians and the Americans. And I don't think that we will experience any kind of true solution, if a true solution is still possible, which I question, without a deep involvement and an agreement and a compromise between Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin. They have a record on that. So I think it's not impossible. My only question is whether it is still possible or maybe it is too late. If you take the Russian perspective, of course, Ukraine is an existential issue. It is really a challenge to the very existence of the Russian Empire and of the consistency of the Russian influence in the named gray area. I don't have to explain how Ukraine is perceived in the Russian public opinion and especially in the Russian elite as part of the motherland, in fact, and to them, a war for Ukraine is a true possibility. As for the Americans, leaving Ukraine in a kind of new Russian sphere of influence would be considered a devastating defeat, especially from the point of view of those who still think of Russia as a kind of Cold War enemy. And this is a quite influential part of the American establishment, as far as I can see. Of course, we have the possibility, as I said, of a kind of Yugoslav scenario. I don't need to tell you what it means, especially here in Ljubljana. But I think that the Europeans have now a big responsibility because they would be probably, after the Ukrainians, victims of such a nightmare. And I think that a negotiated solution based on a Russian-American-European agreement and a more or less new legitimate leadership in Kiev, because what we lack now is a truly legitimate leader in Kiev, because of course Yanukovych was democratically elected and the result of the elections were considered more or less fair by the European Union, but in terms of de facto legitimacy, I don't think that he is able to sign an agreement for every Ukrainian, maybe not even for Eastern Ukraine, since his relations with the Russians are deteriorating day by day. I hope this agreement will be signed in the next future and it will be respected by everybody interested in the Ukraine. And as a compensation of sorts, we may imagine Lady Ashton being invited to the signing ceremony of the International Peace Treaty in some 5-star glorious Swiss hotel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caraccio.
Thank you.
You set the scene perfectly for our next speaker, Dr. Busek, who is both the practitioner and the person deals with theoretical issues. And let me say that when I look at the map of Danube Institute that he's heading, I found a very strong similarity with the borders of former Count K. I shouldn't explain what Count K is probably in this setting. The former empire that was in existence until 1918. And speaking about Ukraine, from Slovenia, Ukraine, the distance to Ukraine from the Lendava, which is the most eastern city in Slovenia, to the Ukrainian border, it's 500 kilometers or even less. So for us, normally in Slovenia, Ukraine is far, far away, but in practice, it's actually our neighborhood. And of course, it's also, Ukraine is bordering to 4 EU members states: Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. And with its pessimistic approach or analysis, realistic pessimistic, stating that EU doesn't have foreign policy, I would like to ask our guest whether EU has tools, or if it doesn't have policy, probably then it doesn't have tools neither, even though you were involved in those tools in your Balkan experience. Dr. Buzek, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, also for your introduction. I think my institute is also looking for Bulgaria, Turkey, and so on and so on. It was not the Habsburg Empire. It has to be said quite clearly. But for sure, I think the historical background plays a very important role. Sometimes I may say, commenting these 100 years of Sarajevo, there's too much look to the history and not enough look to the future. That's my fear concerning all these celebrations happening, because we have to look for the next generations, and that's not what has happened, because we cannot settle the problems of the past. They have happened. Dobar dan, dragi prijatelji, but it's the only Slovenian I can do. I think to talk in Viennese German would be a nice temptation, but it's not very helpful for this conference. I think you introduced me, I think, in the right way, and I only want to mention my experiences concerning the question of security. I think I was very much involved supporting so-called dissident groups before 1989 for a very long time. I did it since the Prague Spring, and I think it was a huge advantage for me and an opportunity, because here I met really outstanding personalities in this context, and I will never forget this. So I dare to make a very positive statement in the beginning. I think the whole development until now is an improvement of Europe. I think we are sometimes forgetting that the breakdown of the Iron Curtain has totally changed Europe, because Europe before 1989 was not possible. I think it was the one part for integration, very much pushed by the Americans in this direction, also protected by NATO and so on and so on. And now we have the responsibility to build up a new Europe. And you won't believe it, by all criticism, in which I am also very much involved, I think until now, in comparison, it's a very positive process which has happened. Because you should not forget that the downfall of big empires, for example, the Soviet Empire, I think would have created in the past wars. We had no wars. We had only 4 wars by the downfall of Yugoslavia. We should have been aware of this. But for the other developments, I think it was comparatively peaceful, which is an advantage. So far, the criticism on the European Union and on other Europeans is necessary, but we should have this feeling that there are also positive side results. And my experience, and I'm now jumping to this, is coming out of this. I was asked by an Assistant Secretary of State of the Americans in 1996 to be the High Representative of the Southeast European Cooperative Initiative. Forget it. The abbreviation SECI is sometimes mentioned still. And I think it was an instrument after the Dayton Agreement, because the Americans were fully aware that the armistice which has happened here and the creation of a lot of new states in this context is creating problems for regional cooperation. I think I have to be very outspoken. The European community in this time was not aware about this. I think this SECI initiative was very much blocked by the Europeans, saying a right sentence, the Balkans are European affairs, but it did nothing in this time. I think out of this there came a learning process which created the next job I had, the Stability Pact for Southeast Europe. I think here, thanks to Joschka Fischer, I think I want to drop this name. He said we have to build up an instrument similar to SECI, even more responsible. I think after a German who was in charge for 2 years, I overtook it until the end of the Stability Pact, because in 2008 we were able to move it to the Regional Cooperation Council. It's sitting now in Sarajevo. Again, Sarajevo is appearing. I think to create regional cooperation on this subject as an instrument of crisis management. As I finished my job, I wrote a small book with the title Too Less, Too Late. And that's still true for the crisis management, not only of the European Union. I think I may say in general. I think we cannot be proud on everything. I think the United Nations are even more under critiques. What's happening in Syria, what the consequences of the Arab League and so on are really horrible by the view of human rights. I think it is even shocking if you're looking to the TV news and seeing all these pictures and so on. I think we are blamed all for this concerning the quality of the humanities here existing. I'm admiring ourselves that we are able to look quite silently to this and not being shocked. I think sometimes if you see it, you can break out in tears even about our inability to jump in this. So far, the security question is extremely important. I think what we have to learn, and sometimes it's not yet done, is a multi-dimension of security. I think I was a little bit wondering by the announcements of the new German government that they have to do more on security, and partly it was immediately a discussion about military engagement. Personally, I would say military engagement is not the solution for more security, because the real problem is, okay, if military engagement is happening, it's always a question, what is afterwards? You can see it, for example, NATO intervention concerning Kosovo. It was not quite clear what is afterwards. I think so far, a lot of difficulties appearing there, and to be quite outspoken. And I don't want to blame any government, and I don't want to blame the European Union. I want to blame us all, because I think concerning management for security, crisis management, I think there's not enough developed, and many thanks, I think, for the title of our meeting here, because I think it is a certain kind of support. We have changed the approaches. I think it is not only military. For example, here in the Balkans, by the Stability Pact, we had an instrument. The abbreviation is Rakviak. Don't ask me what it means. It is based near to Zagreb. And the downsizing of the armies of the region, I think, is a success story. The real problem is what to do with the officers. For sure, because I think they have only learned the military job and nothing else. And I think to retrain them was extremely difficult, but it was a success story. I think it's really possible. The next job concerning security is connected with police. I think, may I say, we have a very limited dimension on police. It's always, I think, if a crime is happening, I think the police has to catch the criminals and bringing them to justice and so on and so on. We developed also something. It's an instrument. It was cross-border crime fighting institution. It's based in Bucharest, in this horrible Ceausescu building on the 10th floor. And it is a cooperation of the governments in the region. How was it done? One officer of the police and one officer of the customs. Because I think for the first move, the crime was seen customs, smuggling, and so on and so on. May I tell you the difficulty which is still existing, the cooperation between the different countries involved. I think if you have, for example, drugs smuggled by a truck which is owned by a Serb. The driver is a Turk. Those who are doing the job are Bulgarians, and those who might be involved are French or German. I think to bring them to court is extremely difficult because we have no European or no international system to do it. That's also the problem of Europol. Europol is extremely important, but in my talks with Europol, they always said to me, we are not getting all the information from the member states. Still, the member states and the justice system is protecting their information for themselves. I think they have the impression we are more powerful if only we know it and not the others. And so far, it's a big chance for criminals because they are protected by this lack of cooperation in practice. Officially, all signed, all agreements, but in fact, and I'm inviting you, go to La Hague and ask them, they have the difficulties to get the informations. It is really a huge problem, security here. And for sure, and I've already mentioned it, the cooperation of judicial system. I think to move one criminal from one country to the other and so on, I think even you can say it by some outstanding cases, to bring a criminal from one country to the other it is a national question. We have to protect our nationals, but we are protecting also crime in this context. I think that has to be said quite bluntly, and I tried here to do it in reality because I think it is extremely important. But new questions are coming up which are not so new, but I think they are increasing. It was already mentioned, rightly by the introduction first, migration is a huge problem. I think to be quite outspoken, we are facing a time where migration will be the key issue. It's like at the end of the Roman Empire. I think the Roman Empire, in the western part, was finished by migration. It was not tourism. I think it was quite out of other reasons. They came because they wanted better living conditions. They were looking for gold. It enriched them, and so on and so on. And for sure, they were also by ecological changes, and so on on the move. And that's today. I think here it's one of the key questions. I think we have these photos and reports about Lampedusa, but it's not only Lampedusa. I think it is happening on the borders, on the territories of our Spanish friends in Morocco. It is really on the fences hanging these people. I think I cannot view this because I think it is deeply impressing me. We have it with the Frontex activity, Turkish border to Bulgaria and Greece. It is a huge problem, and we have not yet handled it. And it is not a security question out of military reasons or protection or ministries of interior. I think we have to look to the sources. Why are they moving? They are moving partly out of political reasons. Look to Syria. I think the number of those going out of the country is really huge, and it will be a real problem. Even those we are not handling very well because we have the monies for the refugees and so on and so on. I think the living conditions are horrible. But I think we have to look to the reasons why they are moving. And so far, these are the economic and social differences. I think it's understandable. Everybody wants to go to a better place, to have better living conditions. So far, we have to do everything, I think, to improve the living conditions that they are not moving. Here, still some countries, including my own country, Austria, are quite happy, by the way, because we are getting a lot of labor force for fields where we have no labor force. For example, concerning health, the overage people, and so on and so on. I think that everything is managed by Slovaks, Polish, Serbs, Slovenes, and so on and so on. And we are quite happy. They are doing our job. But at the same time, they are blamed. They shall stay where they are. I think it's a burden. This discussion about the social system also happening in Germany. They are using it, and so on and so on. Okay, if they are here and they were working, I think they have to use it. I think what we have to do is, I think, to improve the situation there. Even, I think, in science and research, we have a brain drain. We are one of the countries having a lot of benefit out of this. What we need is brain circulation. because these people are missed in their own country for an improvement and so on and so on. Here we don't have the right systems. To be quite outspoken, I think Erasmus, Socrates and all these activities is not enough, is not enough. I want to blame here the member states of the European Union because the system, thanks to Ralph Dahrendorf, created years ago, I think has not yet developed. It has to go further on. It was stopped at this level because the national egoism of the member states is a very huge one, and that's not the best solution. Even, and I'm blaming here more the European Union, being a fan of the European integration, I think that education is still not a European subject. It is still based on the nation-state level, is a mistake. Because I think if, and here a general remark, if Europe wants to survive, I think we have to do everything for the common education here in Europe, not the creation of rules and institutions and so on and so on. I think more common situations here on this subject. Why? Because Europe is 7% of the global population. We have no resources like others, and so we have only the resources of the brain. And this is very much depending on education. And if we want to fix our role as Europeans in the global village, I may say, I think we have to focus very much on this subject. This is a question of security. It has to be said quite bluntly. It is not yet understood. I think I want to remember, and my friend Laris is very much involved with the universities, I think the university was an invention of Europe. Not of the nation-state, because the nation-state was not existing at this time in the outgoing Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. And the mobility of the teachers and the students in this time in Europe, going from Pavia to Heidelberg, from Krakow to Paris and so on, was very impressive. I was Minister of Science. I may tell you, to move a university professor from Graz to Linz is horrible within one country.
Impossible, probably.
Impossible. Yes, you are right. Here you can see, I think we are far off European conditions and realities in this context. It's connected with the question of security because we need these links. As I mentioned, the Erasmus, Socrates, Tempus Mundus, and so on, are helpful, are showing in the right direction, but it is for sure not enough done. Second level, where a lot of things have happened, is by the regional funds. I think this is by principle a very good idea. How it is realized, this you can discuss. I think because it's very much depending on the member states or the partners. If I'm looking to IPA, for example, at the Balkans, it's extremely difficult really to do it. The strange thing, and I may tell you, I'm involved in the EU SDR. If you don't know what it is, I understand you. If you don't know it, it's a European Union strategy on the Danube region. I think it is extremely difficult to handle it by bureaucracy because you need on the one side the member states and on the other side of the Commission. I have to blame the member states and I have to blame those who are involved in this program because the bureaucracy is not really able to do it. I think to develop real programs, I think to make feasible projects, develop projects is a huge problem. I think it might be a job. I think we have to develop the administrations in the different countries, not only outside the European Union. I think we have enough money for Romania and Bulgaria, but they are not able to use it. That's a huge problem because the bureaucracy here, I think they are stopped by everything. I'm working on one project, just an example. I think we have regions on the one and on the other side of the Iron Gate along the River Danube. They are totally empty. That's on the Serbian side, Banat, after Belgrade, Smederevo, and so on. And on the other side of the Iron Curtain in Bulgaria, the area of Vidin, and on the other side, Craiova. I think people are moving out. There's nobody there. What is happening is a problem. Everybody is officially concerned, but they are doing nothing because the Roma are coming in. Because it's a poor, empty houses, empty flats, and so on. It's a huge problem. It is impossible to create here a cooperation between the different countries, involving the European Union to do something that the people are staying there and they are getting jobs and so on and so on. Funds are existing. The international financial institutions are prepared to give money. I think to realize the project is one of the huge problems. I think crisis management or security would mean we have to develop more instruments in this direction. I'm not challenging the Commission. I think it's enough if they are preparing the money and not creating too much bureaucratic difficulties. That would be even enough, because the lot of papers you have to fill out for such project is sometimes boring. But okay, it's necessary because on the other side we want to look to corruption and that nothing is misused and so on and so on. But here we need for sure more instruments by administration. And we need more education in this direction. I think, again, I want to repeat this point. So far, I think it's a question of common strategies. Here, we are less developed. Still, if I'm listening to my beloved ministers of interior, I think they are happy to discuss how can we close the borders? Can we re-establish visa demands, and so on and so on. That was my ongoing discussion on behalf of the Stability Pact. Visas to fight criminality. May I tell you, a real successful criminal is always getting a visa. Because otherwise, he won't be successful. That's quite clear. Huh? I think those who are not getting the visa are the poorer on this subject. It is an idiotic discussion by the ministers of interior, but it's very good for the next election term. Huh? If you can say, they have to stay out, problem solved. Huh? Nothing is solved in the reality, and here we have not the right public to discuss the problem. I want to go a little bit deeper. Hopefully I'm not too long. I think we have also to look at the sources about the difficulties. It's more and more the role of religion, or how religion is used politically, I have to say, to be more precise. And we have a confrontation between the secular part of the Europeans, where religion is not anymore playing such a role, and those parts where religion is a help in the social situation, I think, to say it carefully in this context. And we are not really able, I think, to go with this. I may tell you a practical problem in which I'm involved. I know the former Rais ul Ulema of Sarajevo, Mustafa Ceric. He's a very interesting guy, by the way, also very political. I think he gave me a list of those teachers on Islamic religion brought up by Wahhabis and other groups in Bosnia and in Sanjak, going to Austria to teach religion in our classes. The Austrian administration is not able to cope with this, because I was going to the Minister of Education, we have nobody who is understanding the language, what they are teaching, and so on and so on. So far, I think we are getting some radicals. Huh? A lot of them, I think 80 Austrians, were going to Syria to fight on the rightist side, not the right side, but the rightist side. I think that has some consequences. Nobody knows when they will fight in Austria or elsewhere. I think this has to be for sure here done. I think I'm involved a little bit in a discussion what we have to do to change. Maybe it will be an interesting exercise for this group. I think there's a discussion to cancel the job of the Commissioner on enlargement. The argument is a very primitive one. There will be no enlargement possible in the next time. So far, we should not create by a title of a commission the temptation that enlargement should be done. Okay, it's extremely primitive. I think my proposal would be to look for a commissioner to develop more common standards in the European Union, because I think it would be an outstanding job concerning Romania and Bulgaria, beg your pardon, southern Italy, and so on and so on. I think we have some areas in Europe where it's quite necessary to hire up the standards which are here existing, and I think to make more supervisory on this and more assistance, I have to underline it, I think would be extremely good. Next point of security challenges, youth unemployment. I think here the situation is totally changed. It is Southern Europe in a high percentage, and the countries neighboring the European Union. If you are looking to the level of youth employment, I'm admiring this young generation that they have not yet done a revolution. I think they are going to the Plaza Mayor in Madrid, protesting the night, and then they are going home. How long will they go home? Don't underestimate this. if they are not getting jobs. And I think here a common strategy of the member states is not really existing. Again, I don't want to blame the Commission. I think it is a problem of the member states. They are not really focusing. I think countries like my country, we are happy. We have solved the problem quite good. I think that's not enough. I may tell you a primitive example. I'm Jean Monnet professor at Personam. At the last meeting we had in Brussels, it came up what can be done to settle the problem, or to do a contribution. Some of us said, okay, we have to do more language education. Because, for example, the Goethe institutes are overburdened because everybody wants to go to Germany because they are reading in the newspapers that the economic situation is here better. We had a tough discussion because 50% of my beloved Jean Monnet professors were against. It's not our job. I think we have to fit the situation and we have to offer the opportunities where the young generation can get really jobs. It's a security question. I think it should not be underestimated. So far, and I'm only remembering titles, I think it was already mentioned technology and cybercrime. I think I'm not quite sure if we are really prepared, if we have attacks on this, on the energy system, electricity and so on, because I think we are all for decentralization and that the member states should have their own responsibility. But in reality, I think we are getting more and more centralized by technology. I think that has to be understood. It's not a will. I think it's a technology going in this direction. And so far, I think that is my last point, what has to be done. I think we need more knowledge about each other. One of the problems, and Ukraine was mentioned rightly, I think I'm not sure that the real responsible people in Europe know a lot about Ukraine. I think that has to be said quite straight. I think being in discussions and so on here can see the differences which were mentioned by the regions here existing, the different background of history, why it has happened. By the way, the borders of Ukraine, as all the other borders in Europe are not natural. They are really superficial and I think done out of different reasons. I think the main enlargement in the direction of Russians was done by Josef Vissarionovich Chugashvili, alias Stalin, and later on by Khrushchev, putting in a lot of Russians. I think it was a real strategy done in several cases to balance the different nations within the Soviet Union with Russians. I think the problem of Transnistria, for example, is a problem. I think Transnistria was never a part of Moldova. But it was put there, and so it was created. It is the same in Kazakhstan. You already mentioned Caucasus and so on and so on. I think so far, okay, it's a principle of the European Union. Borders cannot be changed. So far, we changed a lot of borders in the recent time, and so on and so on. Here you can see the difficulties for sure existing. There's a lack of information, and in consequence, a lack of strategy. I'm happy that the Weimar Triangle has done the job with the 3 foreign ministers, but on the other side, I think it is that the European Union is really poor on the ability to act. I think this is second best solution. It should be a powerful commission or a powerful official of the European Union doing the job, because we are all neighbors of the Ukraine. I think the question of neighborhood is not only a question of having common borders. I think neighborhood is today in general. Somebody mentions the kilometers from Slovenia to Ukraine. This is even for Austria shorter. I think the distance from Vienna to the western border is longer than from Vienna to Uzhhorod. If I'm telling this in Austria, I have to explain where is Uzhhorod. I think horrible. But it is really in the neighborhood, and it had the name Ungvar, the Hungarians, and so on and so on. And we are very much connected, not only by history. That's more emotional. Emperor Franz Josef and so on. No.
No history.
We have a common responsibility in this context. And also one of the security challenges in crisis management is, I think we need a better education on history. I think I'm the chair of the Center for Democracy and Reconciliation in Southeast Europe. Strange enough, it's a Dutch foundation which is based in Thessaloniki. And we did a confrontation of the history books in the Balkans. It's a nightmare, I may tell you. What did we do in the same book? We confronted the maps and the caricatures. And every of the history books, Greater Romania, Greater Bulgaria, Greater Greece, Greater Serbia, Greater whatever. Huh? And the caricatures were blaming always the others. We are now training with the help of the European Union, I think I have to say, we are getting some money for it, the history teachers, and it's extremely important. And so far I want to look at the end on the question of information, because this is supporting the European citizen. I think what we have to do is not only crisis management by Lady Ashton or by the Weimar Triangle. I think we have to do it also concerning the civil society. I think, for example, Ukraine, who was helping there? It is always Soros. I think you can blame Soros that he earned a lot of money, but he's one of the leading persons in this direction. The Europeans are not doing enough to support the civil society and so on, outside the governments. I think we have to learn to give the civil society the ability, and I think it's the right place to say it here, I think to do more in this direction, including, I think, going to information. That's my last point. I think if you're going home in the evening, go to your TV set. And switching through the 40 or 60 stations you are able to get. You have everywhere talk shows. In every national channel, talk shows. There is no European talk show. I was going to the European Broadcasting Union years ago and was asking, why is there no European talk show? I get a very nice answer. The member companies of the public-private stations do not want it because then they have to divide the advertisement. That's a clear capitalistic answer. Okay, understood. So far we have reports on Olympic Games, football, handball, and everything on European level, no problem. We have no European talk show, but the simultaneous translation is always invented. I think it's really easy. So I'm always saying we have only one European talk show indirectly, that's the Iron Song Contest. Because at the end of the Iron Song Contest, we are voting about each other. And what I'm learning always by this voting, which country is in favor of which country is not in favor. Because the votes are not given concerning the songs. I think it is given by sympathy. So far, my proposal is to skip the songs and let's make the voting. I think that the best political talk show possible because we are learning about each other. And this is extremely important. So far, I think we have to do a lot of jobs in the direction not only on talk shows. Beg your pardon for your patience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buzek. So in half an hour, we got the Schnellkurs of all security risks and threats, contemporary ones. And we got very nice humoristic interventions also. But seriously, we heard there is no EU foreign policy. We heard that we have big problems with toolbox, crisis management toolbox. And the perception or perspective from our Italian colleague was a little bit different one than from the Austrian one. So we have to ask probably now. So we have to ask our northern colleague from Belgium, Mr. Steven Blokmans, who is a senior research fellow for EU foreign policy for the topic or the instrument that doesn't exist. So please.
Thank you on that helpful note. I always have to explain that my salary is somehow warranted when dealing with EU foreign policy, which in some eyes does not exist. So I will beg to differ a little bit with the previous speakers on some points, while not differing too much of opinion, though. I like the last hook on the European Vision or European Vision Song Contest. If that's indeed the only vision that Europe has, it's quite dreadful. But I will try to do is look a little bit at strategic issues. But first of all, thank you to the Pan-European movement of Slovenia for inviting me. And heeding the rallying words of President Geiser yesterday, I will try and, like the predecessors, use a bit of counterintuitivity to to redefine the new security challenges as really being the old ones. As the French say, plus que ça change, plus que ça reste la même chose. Or as my grandma used to say, why throw away perfectly good clothes if in 20, 30 years' time they'll become in fashion anyway again? So I won't be talking about cyber threats. I won't be talking about the use of drones by a standing European Union army. I won't be using references to biological agents as new security threats, but rather focus on the classic geopolitical challenges and take perhaps a more institutional approach and look where the EU is headed in the near-term future. At CEPS, the think tank where I work, we were invited by the in-house think tank of Mr. Barroso, the BEPA, the Bureau for External Policy Advisors, to come up with a forecast by 2030 on Europe's global competitiveness. And at the same time, BEPA asked also other think tanks to come up with a more geopolitical and geostrategic positioning of the European Union by 2030. And here I'd like to resonate, maybe amplify what has been said before. By 2030, taking account of the current demographic trends, the relative further decline of Europe's combined GDP globally, which will fall both below 10%, if not below 7% of which it already is. And when the map of the world gradually centers on Asia-Pacific, then basically we have the European continent, in some Japanese role almost. Far away, a place nice to visit, relatively peaceful and culturally very rich, but in terms of global power, close to zero. And this is something we need to take into account, and in which member states need to take into account. There is not a single member state of the European Union that currently, and certainly not by 2030, will be able to wield the kind of power that they used to wield in the past. So the EU foreign policy is the only way forward if we, thanks to the common will of the member states, want to confront the challenges of the future, and of course also seize the opportunities if we don't want to end up like a latter-day Japan. Geography matters, and to maybe paraphrase what Lady Ashton on more than one occasion has said at the European Parliament, is that what the European Union does in its neighborhood will define the future of the European Union. Note these last words. She did not say will define the role of the European Union in the world. She said it will define the role of the European Union tout court. And I think that's right. And we'll hear more about that by Professor Shepard this afternoon when he discusses how the internal and the external dimensions of European policies interact, and how the external therefore also determines the internal. Now, as a hook, I could use, of course, Victoria Nuland's, by now famous transatlantic love-making phrase to question the relevance of the European Union and its neighborhood, as indeed the wider world. And while the exasperation expressed so vividly by Ms. Nuland may be warranted when one considers how badly the European Union is in fact doing in stabilizing its neighborhood and creating a zone of peace and prosperity based on European Union values, which is almost exactly what Article 8 of the Treaty on the European Union prescribes the Union should do in defining relations with its neighboring countries, then perhaps Ms. Nuland and the State Department in the US may want to consider this, and that is that unlike the United States, which has a very stable neighbor, almost a boring neighbor to the north, and a relatively stable neighbor to the south, Europe is facing a is surrounded by no less than 3 highly volatile, highly dangerous neighborhoods, which it has to tackle at the same time. I refer obviously to parts of the Eastern Partnership. Ukraine has been mentioned, so I won't dwell on that. There are the breakaway regions in Moldova, in Georgia, and there is, of course, the dispute over Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So those are hotbeds, potential flashpoints, actual flashpoints, frozen, simmering, boiling conflicts which the European Union will have to deal with in order to stem all the security challenges that may come from them. In the Middle East, well, the Middle East is on fire already. Syria, of course, where the conflict is bleeding out into Lebanon, into Iraq, essentially creating a porous zone for all kinds of terrorist groups to move across international borders and wreak havoc, with the power of central government waning in these states. And there's, of course, Israel-Palestine as the long-standing conflict. And then, to the south, Northern Africa. It's been mentioned yesterday already by Minister Frattini, again here this morning. There's the security risk and potential breakup of Egypt. There is continued instability in Libya. There are frozen conflicts around as well, in the Western Sahara, for example, and relations with Morocco. So the question is, can the EU handle all 3 at the same time, or should it somehow prioritize? I think here EU citizens, as well as international partners of the EU, the US, China, the United Nations, they expect the European Union to walk and chew gum at the same time, and thus to tackle the 3 challenges, neighborhood challenges, at the same time. Now, in this respect, I would like to make 3 points. One is strategy. The other is the question of too much constitutional law that I referred to yesterday, and 3 is capabilities. And I'll try and be brief on each and every one of them. First, strategy. Security and foreign policy challenges and interests start at home. This is what I said, and what has been very vocally presented also by Mr. Buzek. The economy, migration, energy, etc. So the geography, the physics, and the chemistry naturally deal the cards and determine what's strategically most important and most imminent at the same time. And in this respect, potentially, while all 3 neighborhood issues are important to the European Union, a certain prioritization could be made over time. But what is needed is a new strategic concept. The European Security Strategy of 2003 is inadequate, it's outdated, it's too narrowly focused on security issues, and here a number of ministers of foreign affairs, those of Sweden, of Poland, of Italy, and of Spain, have started a think tank-driven process to come up with a new text for an updated European security strategy which takes a more comprehensive approach to security issues, both geographically defined as well as thematically defined. And these think tanks came up with a so-called European Global Strategy, which was published just before the summer in 2013, and then pushed by these same ministers through the media, all kinds of op-eds, as well as in the Council of Foreign Ministers, to try and kickstart a process led by the High Representative, supported by the European External Action Service, to redefine this ESS from 2003. It seems the High Representative did not show the ambition to take this up in our last year of activities, and that the animo among the other member state foreign ministers were not as much as to put this on the agenda. And basically the EU has kicked the can down the road and will leave it to the next incumbent to replace Catherine Ashton to take this up. And here I think the concept of an extended neighborhood policy, which takes into account what also the neighbors of our neighbors think and how they defend their interests in the common neighborhood or the shared neighborhood, and how they see the challenges pan out with our shared neighborhood, should define or redefine, reset perhaps, the European neighborhood policy that we have today. The ENP, as has been shown in the Eastern Partnership at Vilnius, collapsed as a strategic concept. In the South, it doesn't exist either. The ENP is up for renewal 10 years after it has been launched and created, and here the European Global Strategy may define as such. So the Eastern Partnership ought to be defined, indeed, in conjunction with the definition of relations, common interest with Russia, extending, the trade aspects and moving into the migration aspects, energy, of course, etc. The Middle East will have to be, or the policy of the European Union towards the Middle East will have to be premised on the interests and challenges as seen from Ankara, as seen from Tehran, as seen from Riyadh. The European Union will have to square the circle on the Shia-Sunni divides playing out in the wider Middle East, so as to be able to define a more effective neighborhood policy for the Middle East. And towards the south, it has already been mentioned, it is not sufficient, of course, to deal just with a relation which is defined from Brussels outwards towards the southern shores of the Mediterranean, but ought to take into account the challenges posed by the Sahel, where Al-Qaeda terrorists seem to roam more or less freely, but where at the same time huge opportunities lie for the European Union to tap into human resources and bank on governments that are willing to cooperate with the European Union. So there lies, in fact, an opportunity. And what is heartening in this respect, I think, is that what you see as the post-Lisbon CSDP, Common Security and Defense operations being launched, they really have this geographical focus on the Sahel, it seems. Almost all new missions have been created in that zone of Northern Africa, from the Horn towards Niger and Mali. My second point, too much constitutional law. Articles 3, paragraph 5, 8 of the European Union, 21 of the Treaty on the European Union impose a constitutional obligation upon the European Union, thus the EU institutions and the member states, to create what the treaty says is an area, i.e. one single zone, if you read it really through a legalistic mindset, an area of peace and prosperity which is based on the European Union values. Now this is enshrined, codified in law, but completely devoid of any reality if one considers the position of the European Union in the world today, where it is no longer able to project those values as easily as it did, through the latter part of the 90s and the early 2000s. So there may be too much constitutional law, in fact, pushing on the one hand the European Union to create this, one-size-fits-all type of neighborhood policy, which in reality demands a much more differentiated approach on a bilateral basis. So there's a reset needed on the ENP in policy terms, potentially also in legal terms. And then third point, EU capabilities. Is the EU, in fact, capable of addressing the security challenges in all three neighborhoods? Well, we've heard some critical remarks. Personally, I do not agree with those sniping at the institutions of EU foreign policy, including the European External Action Service, including the function of EU special representatives. I think there are necessary mechanisms at improving or gluing together what essentially are 28 foreign policies in order to create a more coherent, more visible, and eventually a more effective EU foreign policy. So I think we should give it more time, and we should give it more support. The member states should really buy into this system also for reasons that I mentioned at the outset. You know, alone, they simply won't be able to muster enough political weight on the global stage than when they would act together. Now, looking at the capabilities, you know, the post-Lisbon structures are slowly settling. It took a long time. I mean, the EES was born on a stage with, you know, very jealous protagonists already, with the European Commission having lost part of its DG RELEX and part of its, or entirely DG RELEX and part of its DG development, with the Council Secretariat having lost quite a few good men and women as well as instruments. So it was a difficult birth, baptized by fire with the so-called Arab Spring and with all kinds of other crises. But I think slowly what you see, you know, now 4 years and some months after the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, and since January 2011, when the European Action Service was created, is that the other actors in the EU external relations family are getting used to this new kid on the block, or should I say rond-point, Schuman. It seems to me that the few examples of success that the High Representative, supported by her External Action Service, has been able to clinch, and I refer to the facilitated dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina. It has been referred already, but the E3+3 talks with Iran. There are, you know, germs of where the European institutions, the new foreign policy architecture, can occupy a policy space between the 28 member states, between the EU institutions, come up with initiatives, come up with small strategies and policies, and lead that drive for a common foreign policy, which shows that there is a space above and beyond the sum of the 28 member states that can be occupied by the European institutions in crafting or in forging what is an EU foreign policy. It's all very timid. I will give you that immediately, and it will always be relying on the common will of the member states. But if one considers that Foreign Affairs Council's meetings have an agenda which grows, and nevertheless member states, thanks to the continuity provided also by the High Representative in chairing all of these meetings, is more quickly and more effectively coming to conclusions where not all 28 member states have to, or foreign ministers have to raise their hand and really chip in, but where some member states' representatives are actually quite happy to take, you know, a back seat and let the others decide. There seems to be, you know, some continuity growing there as well. Of course, there will be, in crisis, there will be splits between member states. Most famously in 2003 over, you know, the US invitation to invade Iraq. More recently over the question of arming opposition groups in Syria. Member states are hopelessly split on those fundamental issues, and that will probably remain. But incrementally, I think, we see a trend towards a more common EU foreign policy. The structural reform which it will need, and this is maybe thinking a bit outside of the box and blasphemy for those representing member states themselves, but the structural hurdle which needs to be overcome is unanimity decision-making in Council on CFSP matters. There is a very limited set of exceptions to decide on qualified majority voting basis on CFSP-related matters, but they're administrative in nature primarily or procedural in nature. For example, the appointment procedure on an EU special representative. Here I think there is scope for broadening up the qualified majority voting rule and not just depend on, well, constructive abstention by 1 or 2 member states and letting the others decide. By the way, this mechanism has only been used once when Cyprus let the others go in their decisions on creating EU Lex Kosovo, but has never been approached in a different matter. There is a certain widening of the possibility to enhance cooperation between groups of member states, and this happens in practice. I mean, the Weimar Triangle was mentioned, of course, in trying to hammer out a deal in Ukraine. This happens in practice. Structurally, it's also possible in CFSP since the Lisbon Treaty, But my claim would be that in order to create more effectiveness for EU foreign policy, we would need to overcome this unanimity requirement and introduce qualified majority voting in the Council on CFSP matters, with the possibility, of course, of an emergency break procedure for those member states that find that their crucial sovereign rights ought to be respected, even if there is a majority decision by other member states on CFSP matters. I'll conclude. The EU institutions are transitioning this year after the European Parliament elections in May. The selection procedure of commissioners, including the VP, the second hat of Lady Ashton, which may take time, maybe longer than the month of September, which has been assigned to it. The current Barroso II Commission took until February to be installed and get the seal of approval by the Parliament. The normal rules of procedure prescribe that we would have a new figurehead at European Council presidency level and High Representative by the 1st of December, and a new Commission by the 1st of November, which would include, of course, a recompositioning of portfolios. That opportunity arises. So questions may be asked whether we need a commissioner for ENP/enlargement. I would be with those who claim that there is such a necessity. But it would be an opportunity to revisit also the role that the VP and Ashton can play in coordinating within the Commission the external relations portfolios, a job which she has not taken up in seriousness in the last 4 years. She has essentially allowed Barroso to push her away, and instead she has concentrated on beefing up her High Representative hat. But opportunities arise there to activate this Commission side of EU foreign policy and marry the political Council EES High Representative much more with the structural, financial elements within the European Commission. It is also an opportunity to reset that neighborhood policy and infuse new emphasis in the way that I've suggested. Okay, I think I'll stop there. I've talked more than enough.
Thank you very much. As you notice, people who are addressing security are very eloquent. Especially the one who is laughing the most, probably. So we are moving now to second part, Q&A. But before we go directly to the audience, I would like to ask our panelists first to be brief with their answers. And secondly, I think we have to say between the lines, we heard for two times mention of lawful relation, transatlantic lawful relationship. We heard, we know that very important person in U.S. State Department was doing the damage control in post-Snowden era using the phrase transatlantic renaissance. And a few months after that, she used the F word with a correlation to the European Union. And I would like to ask Mr. Caracciolo, what is the influence, so to speak, of UN perception, US perception of European Union being the institution or organization that wants to have its own foreign and security policy?
I remember a cover, it was Newsweek maybe, or Time, when Mr. Bush went to Brussels for the sake of speaking with the EU Commission, and the title was Bush Go to Belgium. And this is still, in my view, the leading perception in the US about the meaning of the European Union. Of course, the Americans are interested in Europe. They have many interests here. But they are interested essentially in Germany, of course in Britain, less in France, and the others are the others.
Thank you very much. We are opening now the floor to the audience. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you very much, Reinhard Klutschik. I'm working for the Pan-European movement in Austria, and I want to make one remark and then ask a second question. The remark is to what Mr. Buzek said about the civil society and that we are not doing enough, or the European Union is not doing enough. I agree with you in principle, but you also have to see what happens with all that money. The fact is that the result is that you have some kind of civil society financed by money coming from outside the Ukraine, and the reception of this organization is that they are somehow steered from outside. And you know the reaction of Mr. Putin in Russia when he said it's forbidden to get financing from outside for the civil society, because the civil society, also in our interpretation as Pan-European Union, would mean it's coming out from the people and not coming with money from outside. So this is a coin with two sides. The question is, on, as you mentioned, the Arab Spring, etc. I'm quoting now from a conversation with my president of Pan-European Movement Austria, and he was quoting from a conversation with an officer from the Israeli intelligence service. And this Mossad man said, in 20 years, there will be no Christians in the Near East. We have Christian communities in all these countries. You see what's happening now. My question to you is, what does that mean for Europe?
Okay, your first remark, that's one of the arguments which is used by Putin, and it might be used also in the following time by Ukraine. I think I'm involved, I have been involved for 15 years at the European Forum Alpbach, and we have groups of young students, for example, in Ukraine and in Russia. I think the support of them are not happening from outside. I'm motivating enterprises, not only Austrian enterprises based in these countries, also, I think, to finance it, having an interest to develop the civil society. I think it's not the job of the European Commission and not the job of the governments of the member states or others to give the money. I think we have to create more motivation. That was the reason why I was very much focusing on the public, that we are getting more pressure in this direction, that there is a responsibility. I think it's for sure better working. I'm chairing the advisory board of the Erste Foundation. We are supporting a lot of social activities in these countries. I think we have no problem because we are solving social problems here. And I think in this way it should be done. I was urging the Austrian Foreign Minister, Minister for European and International Affairs is now the title. I think what the Austrians, for example, should do, I think to invite those who are wounded by all this demonstration, to give medical assistance and social assistance and so on and so on. That is an important sign of interests. I think all the declarations of ministers, beg your pardon, I've been minister, forget it. I think that's paper and it's nice, but it is not really helpful. It's not a sign for those who are involved. To the other question for the Christians, that's a great concern. As far as I know, the Vatican on this subject, for sure. But here I'm very critical. Being a Catholic, I would say the solidarity of the different Catholic churches, I think, is very much limited. I think there should be done quite more here existing. Even if we have discussion in Vienna, if a church which is not anymore used by Catholics because there are not enough by the Serbian Orthodox Church, then we are getting protests, which is idiotic. I think if we can use these places and these churches also for other Christian religions, why not? And so far, I think we have to do it in this direction. It is a great concern. Here, I'm critical of my own church. I think we are missing our own history, because out of this region, Christendom was coming.
More questions?
Morning, Zlatko Mikulic from Slovenian Pan-European Union, what is movement, okay. today it was mentioned these Africans hanging on Ceuta railings. Fences, yeah, that's right. And if you draw the circle from Ljubljana to Ukraine and around, probably we'll find in this circle Tunisia as well.
All right.
So I would like to focus my question on MEDA region. Is there any comprehensive European policy to improve life in this region, to prevent this migration to the north? And my remark, we heard that if I understood, we don't have enlargement commission anymore. So it would be probably wise to have commissioner for neighborhood policy and to focus very much to this region as well. Thank you.
To the first.
Well, I have to qualify some of the very interesting things that Mr. Buzek already said about migration. For example, if you go to Ceuta, which is, as you know, the Spanish exclave in Morocco, you will see that there is, of course, still some kind of south-north migration, but you find now even Spaniards coming to Morocco looking for jobs. So it's a two-way movement. If you go to southern Italy, you will see that in the last couple of months you have less and less people coming to Italy because of our economic crisis. People are informed. So you see we have some side effects of our crisis. And by the way, 90% of our unofficial, I would say it this way, immigrants come from Eastern Europe. We have about 500,000 Ukrainians in Italy. So you see, it's a very mixed picture. As for the EU approach to that, I can't see any, but maybe Mr. Brockman will do.
Well, yeah, very briefly. The MENA region, of course, as far as the southern shores of the Mediterranean are concerned, fall within the European neighborhood policy. But ENP South exists of, well, not so much beyond what has been created through the Barcelona process as the Union for the Mediterranean, which is, if I dare to make the comparison, but Mr. Buzek can prove me wrong, some type of stability pact for the MENA region, whereby concrete projects are being financed in those countries, but where little money is available and where few projects so far have been sponsored. And otherwise, relations are very much determined on a bilateral basis. Morocco is negotiating an association agreement, including a deep and comprehensive trade arrangement with the European Union as the only state in the MENA region. And for the rest, the European Union policies seem to have been overtaken by events. I mean, in Tunisia, it's gone the right way, not necessarily for the European, or thanks to the European Union, but thanks to local dynamics. In Libya, it's gone the wrong way. It's not as if the European Union, through its crisis response and recognition, early day recognition, has been able to change a lot in that country. In Egypt, Lady Ashton, for a short term, found herself in a privileged position as a Western diplomat to be the only one to be able to talk to the imprisoned former President Morsi. But quite quickly, this diplomatic effort was brushed aside by the military regime when it found itself confident enough, to assert control and do, business as they were used to do it. So the European Union policy towards the South is definitely in need of revitalization. It's been suggested that perhaps this could be done in the Monnet type of manner of neo-functional cooperation on issues which are of common interest. Migration is one. Why not have some kind of a regional migration community with those countries and the European Union that want to tackle that problem? on the basis of what exists, for example, for the Energy Community Treaty between the European Union and Southeastern European countries. Maybe energy as such, or the energy community model, could be replicated somehow for those countries of the MENA region as well, as indeed for transport links, etc. So maybe that's a way forward in a more concrete, hands-on manner. But then the problem remains, of course, what to do with everything which lies south of the MENA region. And here, the Sahel strategy, which has been adopted, carved out by the European External Action Service, endorsed by the Council of Ministers, takes a more comprehensive approach towards security issues and development cooperation. And it is this nexus between policies and an integrated approach of implementing instruments, ones have been mentioned before, that could, with the willingness of the local governments, effect change. But that remains to be seen.
If you allow me to make a short remark, I fully underline what was already said here. I think my experience is take specific subjects as an instrument for cooperation. I think all these general declarations, I think you can forget it. I think that's a paper and nothing. You have to realize it step by step. It's like a mosaic where you have to put the pieces here in reality together. We have one difficulty, and I think that's also true for the Mediterranean activity. I think still there is a thinking left in Europe, especially with a colonial approach. I think it can be only done by France, if it is looking to Africa and so on and so on. That's wrong. Yes, I would be even more in favor if somebody is doing it who his country has nothing to do with the past. I think that's quite necessary because also the suspicion is immediately created to re-establish it. It's not anymore working.
Well, that's sorry. I fully agree, and we must say that, for example, some Scandinavian countries are quite active now, for example, in Libya and Norway in particular, and they are quite successful, and they have a fresh approach to that area. One of the problems, I'm not speaking now of the EU institutions, so one of the problems we have now in that area is that, as you know, we had there our sons of a bitch, the Gaddafis, the Ben Ali, and the Mubarak. And it was very easy when we had a problem, call them and settle it with them. Now we don't have telephone numbers anymore. We have lots of militias, mafias, etc., and it is very difficult to find out who is really able to deliver. I had a conversation a couple of days ago with a guy of our major energy company who told me we don't know what militia to buy now because we used to know who were the tribes in charge of a specific territory. Now we don't know because it's a real chaos in Libya. And second point, don't forget that all those countries, or maybe to be more precise, non-countries, are in a state of Cold War. Take Algeria and Morocco, take Algeria and Libya, take, for example, Mali. It's really a picture of chaos and of informal powers. And you know, informal powers are not so easy to detect. You know where formal powers are, but you don't know where informal, namely true powers are.
But it has to be said it was also easier for corruption. Yes. I think you knew whom to address.
Absolutely. That was the meaning.
That was the final remark. We started late. We are finishing late. Thank you very much to all the panelists.